Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. We are really looking forward to an exciting series on global food and agricultural trade and its importance for sustainability and food security for our own national economies, but also for the world trading system. My name is Don Buckingham, and I am the President and CEO of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, located in Ottawa, Canada. CAPI is a place for agri-food leaders to come together to share their insights and advance ideas on emerging issues facing our important sector. And our work reflects systems thinking, researching complex and interconnected food issues, bringing diverse voices to the table from across agri-food supply chains, governments, researchers, adjacent sectors, and adjacent countries, trading partners in the international trading system. This series that we're presenting right now is part of a fairly interesting and long relationship of conferences that CAPI has done in partnership with the Farm Foundation in Washington. And given everything that's happening in the world right now from a trading point of view, this series could not come at a better time. Our countries are in a very uncertain state, and CAPI and the Farm Foundation both felt that joining forces would ensure a larger perspective and the ability to piggyback on our capacities, our joint information, and our knowledge. And so we look forward this morning to a fruitful discussion. We're very excited that you've been able to join us, and we hope that you will be able to engage in the question and answer period, which is following our presentation by speakers. This particular dialogue will focus on the very basic challenges that exist in trading institutions that preceded COVID-19. And it brings to the forefront how we're going to manage agricultural trade in this increasingly chaotic world. We have panelists, and we're really blessed by this, from the United States, from Canada, from Australia, and the European Union this morning to share their views on the current state of agricultural trade, the future of the multilateral trading system, and in fact, the future of food trade through the lens of pandemic recovery and concerns over food security and what might become the next normal. So we're very excited to kick off this first session, but before we get started, I would just like to review some webinar guidelines. So basically, we are going to be broadcasting here with speakers and our moderator. And if you're posting on social media, then I would love for you to use the hashtag handle at AgTrade. So please join us there, and we will start off with an opening remarks from the chair of the board of Farm Foundation and from myself, and then we'll move right directly into the panel. So we are very, very pleased to have this wonderful panel of experts and our moderator, Elaine Feldman from the board of directors at CAPI. And our panel is going to be part live and part pre-recorded message. So I invite you to submit your questions online at any time during the presentations, and we'll be compiling those questions, and then I will be going through them and presenting them to the moderator to put to the panel. And so from that, I'd like to turn it over to Larkin, who is the chair of Farm Foundation in the US. Larkin, please.
Oh, thank you, Don. And my remarks today are, let's see, can you hear me? Thank you, Don. My remarks today are very brief. I just want to thank all of you for joining us for this important dialogue to discuss the ever critical issue of agricultural trade. The Farm Foundation is proud to partner with CAPI in bringing this dialogue series to you today. As you can see before the slide before you, Farm Foundation is an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture. Our vision is to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world, and our mission is to build trust and understanding at the intersections of agriculture and society. Among other things, we try to accomplish this by facilitating nonpartisan objective dialogue and creating multi-stakeholder collaborations. This is a good example of such an event. And I look forward to hearing from our speakers today. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Elaine Feldman, board member of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, to begin our first session.
Thank you very much, Larkin. Thank you for joining us today for the first dialogue in the Managing Agricultural Trade in an Increasingly Chaotic World dialogue series. I'm sure you're all very eager to hear what our panelists have to say this morning. And our panelists are Alan Oxley, Joe Glauber, John Clarke, and Peter Clarke. We're first going to hear from Alan Oxley, founder and strategic advisor at ITS Global, consultants on global issues. As Alan resides in Australia, he has pre-recorded his contribution using the 4 questions each panelist received as a guideline for this session. And I think what we're going to hear is Alan speaking to each of those questions.
I'm Alan Oxley. I've been invited to contribute to review by Canadian agricultural specialists. I joined the Australian Foreign Service in the 1980s and served in Singapore and the United Nations in New York, and was invited by the Trade Minister to serve as Australia's ambassador to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in Geneva. At the time, the US and European Union had agreed to drive an independent strategy for wide-ranging reform of the GATT. It was long overdue. But the EU, in fact, had been rather cool on further liberalisation of agriculture, which of course has been our principal interest here. But Australia found a number of GATT members keen to increase access for agricultural products in trade. This included the US, Canada and New Zealand, and later on, agricultural producers in Asia and South America. The European community did not want agriculture addressed, but one of the long-term interests that we all express in this negotiation over time is that we were able to put agriculture on the table and significantly advance it. It was one of the key outcomes of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations. After 4 years in the GATT, I left government and set up a trade advisory service supporting trade reform in the Asia-Pacific region. I was head of the Australian arm of the APEC Study Centre for 2 decades. Question 1. In light of recent developments in global trading environment, both prior to and during the COVID pandemic, what do you think the future holds for multilateralism and global rules-based trading systems? I do not see why the COVID pandemic should figure significantly in this case. There is tension between China and the US in trade, which has been kept actually orderly, as indeed has most trade between major trade economies. However, the US and China appear to have struck an agreement over how issues in dispute in agricultural trade will remain managed. There is a commitment by both Washington DC and Beijing to complete a second phase in trade negotiations between both, presuming Trump will be re-elected. Although one has to note that today Trump's political standing has now got some elements of uncertainty. Trump's criticisms of the WTO are not without ground. The significant majority of developing countries who have lined up with Africa and other developing economies have blocked further expansion of the WTO for nearly 3 decades. The WTO needs to be divided into a 2-class system where developing economies keen to liberalise the trade markets can do so, and the other economies can continue to operate at a lower level. As well, the most advanced and liberal trade agreement, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP agreement, has been activated and is in a position in time to attract other parties. The UK, which is very interesting, and sees the agreement as an important driver of change and is looking to join that agreement as time passes. Question 2, what are the greatest risks to our global trading system as we emerge from COVID? Failure to take the opportunity of adjusting coverage in the WTO and major regional and bilateral trade agreements of new systems is not having the impact that it should on driving change in trade policy. Advanced trade agreements recognise electronic commerce, encourage international capital, liberalise services and adopt digital trade. These are the new areas which need attention. Some of these are already covered in the CPTP agreement. But not all economies are willing to move to this level, and this has been particularly a problem in the WTO itself. We've reached a situation where there are really two levels of activity. Those active economies in Australia and Canada, the United States and the EU, and the active economies in the Pacific region are keen to see further advances made in order to get greater benefits from the trading systems. But in the WTO, we have a majority of states who don't wish to move in that direction. Action is needed to separate these two. Question 3, was it a mistake to have China join the WTO, and how has its membership in the multilateral trading system affected our global trade system's health? Well, the Chinese have not really been too far off being when it comes to compliance with WTO standards. In fact, most developing countries have rights not to comply with all measures in developing country agreements. India is an outstanding case. Indian states, not the central government, set trade policy, and that's who controls trade policy in India, which makes it difficult for it to be able to contribute significantly. In comparison, China is more diligent and compliant with WTO rules than many other developing countries, but it too has not sought to acquire full compliance with the WTO system. It did not secure full compliance with the GAP rules until the year's negotiations were launched to improve content of the Doha round. Even today, China's trade agreements are not complete. That said, China is a more diligent member of the WTO system than many other members. President Trump's pressure on China to associate more closely with the actions of other WTO governments has had an effect. China has agreed to match changes in policy, which other member states have found wanting. However, as experience in Australia and Canada has shown, China can impose restrictions on trade transactions in return for disagreements on other terms with other countries. Question 4. What do you see as the way forward to enhance agricultural trade and global food security? Do we have the right to international mechanisms, institutions and cooperation, for example, the Ottawa Group and the Cairns Group, or goodwill in place to ensure that the future global trading system can emerge unscathed and better prepared for future challenges? As noted in previous comment, the full benefit of adoption of various levels of commitment on particular issues in trade policy should no longer be measured according to the extent of common compliance in policy. The WTO stalled and remains incomplete because too many members refuse to accept measures with which they disagree. The requirement that all WTO members need to approve any new measures is out of place. This is one of the reasons why the failure to develop the Doha round stalled after 10 years of efforts to try to get a result with no success. Now, there is a considerable difference in capacity between what member states can manage. Varying degrees of capacity need to be established. A number of economies seek high levels of compliance on more complicated issues. A system which demands no action can be taken unless every member of the WTO approves is archaic and counterproductive. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity for participating in this exercise. It's very important. And I believe from this that the focus that can be achieved by our partner countries and economies are in a prime position to try and adjust the systems so that the gains that can be made by those economies who wish to deal with changes in the modern world can progress and raise living standards. And those developing countries who still have difficulty keeping up, they can work at their own pace and own time. Over time, these do gradually seek to join the more advanced economies, and that's what we should be seeking to achieve. May I thank you for offering me the invitation, the opportunity to participate in this. I'm very pleased to do so. It's very important work, and I wish all our colleagues in the various companies concerned the best of luck and the best of good returns. There is a lot to be done.
Thank you. I found that a very interesting presentation, and I'm hoping that our panelists are going to pick up on some of the points that Alan made with respect to the future of the WTO. Unfortunately, Alan can't be with us to respond to any questions that any of the members of the panel or the participants have. So now we have our three remaining panelists. First, we're going to hear from Joe Glauber, who is a senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in the United States. Then we'll hear from John Clarke, who is the Director for International Relations at the DG Agriculture and Rural Development in the European Commission. And finally, we'll hear from Peter Clarke, President of Ray Clarke, Shih and Associates from Canada. And just a little reminder that you can submit your questions at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So, Joe, over to you.
Great, Elaine. Thanks so much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Farm Foundation and CAPI for putting together this program. I think both of these sessions, the one we're doing today and the one in 2 weeks, look excellent, and I think they couldn't come at a better time. I guess to start this discussion, I mean, we certainly have had a lot going on over the last 3 months, let alone the last 3 years, but I think it is, following on Alan's comments, important to look back really to the slowing of the trade talks and everything after 2008. I think there were a lot of people that were hopeful that we'd see an agreement be reached in the Doha round. That sort of petered out right after 2008 for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the recession that occurred then. But apart from some significant, but relatively, I think in the grand scheme of things, minor harvesting of low-hanging fruit in Bali and Nairobi. I mean, something significant. Certainly the elimination of export subsidies is very, very important, but really little progress made on the other major pillars, at least in the ag sector, on domestic support and market access. And then, you know, we had a sea change, as it were, at least here in the U.S., with the election of Donald Trump and a rapid about-face in terms of a lot of things in terms of trade policy. I think within the first week, the U.S. had pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Announcements were made first to cancel NAFTA, but then to renegotiate it, and with a lot of unilateral actions using trade remedy law on aluminum and other commodities, such that the U.S. found itself within 12 months of being at war with a lot of major trading partners, many of which, at least in the past, have been very strong allies. So I think U.S. producers have had to adjust to that, certainly, because while the 301 actions and other actions that the administration has taken have been aimed at essentially non-ag commodities, the counter retaliations from other countries have largely been centered on U.S. agricultural exports. And so certainly the biggest of those was China, and starting in July 2018, very big tariffs going on major agricultural products. You saw almost a replumbing of the U.S. or of the global trading system, with soybeans from the U.S., which would normally be going to China, having to find other markets, while the demand from China, which accounts for 2/3 of the world soybean imports, all of a sudden having to concentrate all of their sourcing from South America. As a consequence, again, big price changes, falls in the US, which Congress or the administration then stepped in and provided an unprecedented, a massive amount of assistance to US farmers to the tune of some $28 billion. The other big thing was the attack on the WTO itself, and that is through the dispute settlement system, which the refusal to appoint new appellate body members essentially come January or December of last year rendered that body, the appellate body at least, has been moribund ever since. And that's, you know, for U.S. agriculture, that's been a system that has actually worked very well. I think if you go back to all the ag cases, or at least the cases that have involved agricultural products, be that in the Agreement on Agriculture or other agreements, the U.S. has won about 80% of those. So that's a system that actually has worked well for U.S. agriculture. But on top of that, now you have, as I mentioned, these massive payments that went out to compensate farmers that were hurt by the trade actions taken by other countries against, in retaliation for trade actions taken by the Trump administration. On top of that, then, of course, is the most recent crisis with COVID, which has affected global markets, affected all agricultural producers. And there too, the U.S. has provided a lot of extra assistance to farmers with the most recent package, some $19 billion in additional monies, with an additional $14 billion likely to go into effect come mid-January or mid-July, just in a few weeks, likely to see another package going out to farmers. The consequence of all that, unfortunately, is that the U.S. now looks to be likely exceeding WTO limits on domestic support in 2019, and support levels could be well over $30 billion for 2019 and 2020, which again would put these things over the domestic support limits agreed to under the Uruguay round agreements. So I think these are trying times. Certainly, Alan mentioned a lot of the problems I think that do exist in the WTO, and perhaps out of all of this, there's a potential for a renewed effort to try to get back to the negotiating table to reform the WTO. I think the Ottawa Group and other things have been very positive movements in that direction, and hopefully the U.S. administration will return to that, to a more positive, what in my view at least would be a much more positive effort to reform rather than just to criticize. And with that, let me stop.
Turn to John Clarke.
Hello, I hope you can all see me. Let me just adjust the picture a bit. Thank you very much, Elaine and colleagues, and for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. I'm John Clarke. I'm not Peter Clarke without an E, who's speaking next. I've been an official for the EU for 27 years as a trade negotiator. Before that, I spent 10 years as Hong Kong's trade negotiator, including the Uruguay round. So I'm one of the few public officials who have Uruguay round experience. So, you know, I'm still standing, as Elton John would say. And my experience working for the Hong Kong government for 10 years as a negotiator and for the EU only confirms my strong commitment to multilateralism and to the rules-based trading system, which is really under threat at the moment. And I think it's very timely that this conference takes place to review the WTO agri-food trade and you know what the future holds. I think we would all agree that the WTO is in a crisis, even if there are 7 candidates for the DG post, so that some people have confidence that it has a future. It has a future, but it's been in a crisis almost since the inking of the Euro go round. Yeah, we paid the price of our success. We expanded the remit of the GATT from modest tariff cuts amongst a small group of developed countries to a very comprehensive negotiation agreement covering trips, services, agriculture, textiles, health and safety regulations, and with the, apart from China, the whole world committing. So it was a very, very big game changer, and I think we're seeing, unfortunately, the cost of that ever since Seattle, with more and more countries and societies very worried about globalization, about being the losers from globalization. The WTO has not been the cause of that, but it's been impacted very much by this sense of dispossession amongst many people around the world. Bigger and bigger gaps between the rich and the poor, and a lack of an ending of what they used to call the Washington Consensus or the Geneva Consensus about the multilateral system and a social market economy. So the WTO has suffered a lot from this trend in the last few years, and it's got exacerbated, as Joe Glauber hinted just now, with more and more populist and nativist politicians and leaders around the world. So we have some big challenges ahead, I think, to try to get the WTO back on track. Africa has not reaped the benefits of the WTO. Not the WTO's fault. There are many reasons for this, but one of the things we have to get right in the next few years is to try to support sub-Saharan Africa in integrating into the international trading system and realizing its potential. Secondly, we are, and the WTO is a playground for this, we're facing a kind of a systemic, strategic geopolitical battle between the USA and China. Alan Oxley made some very pertinent comments about China a minute ago. What we're seeing in WTO is being played out across the whole of the international scene. A sense from the US side that China is not pulling its weight, constant with its economic power, that it needs to reform, that trade and technology and security are very, very interlinked and blurred, and that the WTO is not fit for purpose when it comes to the emergence and the entry into WTO of a major player like China, who is not a complete market economy. And we're in a very different situation from the halcyon days of the Euro round, where today 2 out of the 3 key WTO members, USA and China, are in conflict, are in trade conflict and a certain degree of geopolitical strategic rivalry. This is quite extraordinary. Now, I'm not sure whether now is that in the introductory moments is to look at solutions, but certainly post COVID, I think we need to realize our interdependence. We should not batten down the hatches and go solo. We need to really recognize that economic integration, trade, health policy, SDG commitments, these are all very much related, and every part of the international community has to work in sync and in tandem. WTO cannot be isolated from the rest of the UN system, and vice versa. So I hope that in the future we can restore multilateral relations across the board. And I'll be happy to speak about that later this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Now we're going to turn to another Clarke. As John said, it's Peter Clarke without an E. Peter will be our final speaker, and then we'll move to questions.
Oh, my experience in the the GATT began in the early 1970s, prior to the Tokyo round, when I was counselor at the mission in Geneva, chairman of the Committee on Budget, Finance, and Administration, and entirely too much involved in textiles. Have been involved in negotiations ever since then, up until the Doha meetings, as an advisor to the whoever happened to be the Minister of International Trade in Canada. The situation in the WTO began to fall apart when ministers thought they were going to have a 5-year deal in the Doha round. Very optimistic, and it didn't happen for reasons which were related to establishing an agenda which could never be sold to Congress, that is a development round. And with the shift in management of the WTO and negotiations from the Quad to a much broader group where there were different interests. Virtually everything that can be said about the current problems has already been said. My focus would be on domestic support. Export support will be hopefully eliminated soon, but domestic support is still causing problems. If we're going to deal with the more broadly based membership of the WTO, I think we have to do a catalog of concerns of individual countries to see how we can group them together. And I mentioned domestic support because we know that that India has problems with domestic support. Many other countries do. Canada has problems with domestic support in the United States, which is, for political reasons, much more generous than it is in Canada. One of my concerns about the support that Joe mentioned, and which others could mention for their own areas, is this could become subject to trade remedy disputes because these are subsidies. With respect to the agreements coming out of trade wars and trade disputes, where preferential arrangements are made for the supply of agricultural products, Canada has not done too well with those because the deals are being made by other countries, and there will be others. South America has benefited from a number of measures taken against the United States. And we find as well that China, who I think has been a positive addition overall to the WTO, when it becomes offended by measures and actions against its interest, will take trade actions against the offending country. That's a real problem. I'll get into the various issues in more detail in response to the questions, but it is really a crucial time for trade. There are other problems that have to be addressed as well, like climate change. And one of the problems that I see in trying to fix the WTO, if we're going to fix the WTO, and I think we should, is that people with other agendas are going to try to superimpose those agendas on the resolution of the problems in the WTO generally, and with agriculture in particular. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you to all of the panelists. I think we've heard some very interesting points about recent trade disruptions and their implications for agri-food markets and the future of the multilateral system. Now, before we respond to the questions that you've been submitting, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as moderator and ask a few questions of our panelists. First, Joe, I'd like to turn to you, and I'd like your thoughts about what we heard from Alan Oxley with his point that the WTO is going to need to effectively split into two groups: those who are prepared to move forward with trade liberalizations and those who aren't. And what you think that means, whether in particular for issues in agricultural trade.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, Elaine. I do think that I tend to be on that side as well. I think the frustration that many countries had in 2008 trying to get an agreement, I think that, I mean, frankly, I give Pascal Lamy and a lot of others credit for moving those negotiations as far, and Crawford Falconer, who was chair of the Ag Committee at the time, of moving those negotiations as far as they could move them, and you know, to get the brackets down to something you could count on one hand or so. But it still, at the end of the day, was very, very difficult to move beyond that. And I think the problems in NAMA were equally tough. So how do you do that? I mean, I think the WTO allows for a plurilateral approach. I think there you want to make sure, however, that it isn't exclusionary, and that other countries, once there is an agreement among those who are willing to move forward, that other countries can join. And I think that's sort of a key thing about any plurilateral. And one of the problems I have with going outside the WTO for these, free trade agreements and multilateral agreements is that they tend to be exclusionary, and they tend to bias or shape trade flows. I mean, I get why people do them, because if you're not making progress in one arena, why not go to another arena? But I think for the multilateral system to work as best as it can, I think the best thing is to try to pull that in and at least allow entry for with other countries.
Can I ask if John or Peter have any thoughts that they'd like to share about what Joe and Alan before him have said?
I'll go ahead if you want, Elaine.
Thanks, Peter.
Many years ago, Sidney Galt, who was a former British negotiator, wrote a book called GATT Plus. And it was interesting, but nobody was really interested because it's difficult to have an effective organization if it's really divided in two. Having said that, the consensus basis of operating the WTO is not working, not likely to work. And I think we definitely need to try to keep as much as we can and look at reform. And one of those reforms would be to get rid of the consensus system.
Big change. John, what's your reaction to that?
Well, thanks, Elena. That was quite a provocative suggestion from Peter. I don't think, well, one cannot get rid of consensus because it's in the rules, and nobody's going to, no turkey will vote for an early Christmas, if you like, yeah. So it's not going to happen. But it doesn't matter, because in practice we have ways around that. We can negotiate plurilateral agreements, and we're doing that already on e-commerce, on services facilitation. That is the way forward. We have the experience of the trade facilitation negotiations, where we have a multilateral agreement, but with every member has its own tailor-made set of commitments. So an approach to development and S&D, which does not divide the membership into the sheep and the goats, but it's very, very tailor-made for each member. So there are several ways to skin the cat, as it were, when it comes to developing approaches which suit the different levels of every member. And I think we will, I'm sure, in the next 5 years, be digging more deeply into these different negotiating formulas and structures that will allow us to move forward with the membership as a whole, sometimes plurilaterally, sometimes accepting a certain amount of free ridership, but moving the system forward without anybody being left behind. I would pick up on a point that Joe made, which I think I've always shared with him, is that FTAs are very much a second best option. Yeah, they are they are discriminatory by nature. It's a pity that since 2008, when the Doha round collapsed, all of us had to move promiscuously, if you like, into FTAs as the way to improve market access. We've all done that. We're all guilty. We're all sinners. Every country in the world virtually is doing FTAs. It undermines the WTO system. It makes it that much harder to get back to where we used to be. And I hope that the FTA agenda will soon exhaust itself, and we'll turn back to multilateralism as a much more fair way of managing our international relations.
Well, I'm not quite so optimistic about it. 5 years is a long time. Who knows where we'll be then? I don't think there's any silver bullet which is going to permit us to do this quickly. And if it's provocative, I think it's because we do need to look at very, very significant movements with respect to how the WTO operates if we hope to salvage any of it at all.
Perhaps I can pick up on this and Joe, going back to you again, you mentioned, I think, that the U.S. agricultural community has done very well out of WTO dispute settlement. I think you said that they've won 80% of the cases. We're in a situation now where, because of lack of consensus, particularly from the United States, we no longer have a functioning appellate body in the WTO, and it's not at all clear yet what that's going to mean for the system. So I wonder if you have any comments with regard to consensus, the US, and what that means in terms not just of negotiating new trade rules, but making sure that they're enforceable.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's hackneyed, I guess, to refer to it as the crown jewel, but I think it is. In fact, it's been the one thing that has functioned very, very well, I think, from at least my perspective. When I say the U.S. has won 80% of the cases it's taken against the other members, by the same token, it's lost cases that have been taken against it. But I think that speaks to the high bar, in one sense, that one needs to have. One needs to come in with evidence that and a good case that to make a case against a country that their policies are in violation of one agreement or another. How to get that back? I think that the U.S. There's been a lot of criticisms the U.S. has leveled against the dispute settlement body, and I mean those have been shared in some cases by others. Certainly, some of the procedural rules and operations of the body have been at variance with what's actually in the understanding, the dispute settlement understanding. The bigger problems, I think, the more structural problems are, what I guess would be considered by some overreach on the part of the appellate body of making decisions that go beyond what some feel are in the agreement themselves, and I think those are going to be harder things to resolve if there's to be reforms of the appellate body. Unfortunately, I think a lot of I mean, people have made this case before, but a lot of the Trump administration dissatisfaction with the appellate body is colored, I think, a little bit, or a great deal, frankly, by domestic trade remedy law and the fact that they don't like to see the appellate body ruling against some of the actions that what they feel are, U.S. is entitled to impose. And I think those will, again, there you have more substantive debate among members about what the proper role of the appellate body. But I think it's fine. Let's have that debate and let's try to resolve it. But I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater, again, because I think the system by and large has served U.S. industries very, very well.
Thank you. Can I ask Peter or John Clarke if they want to make any additional comments on this? And if not, we'll turn to the questions that have been submitted while the panelists have been speaking.
I'll say a few words after Joe on the appellate body and US. I think Joe summarised it perfectly. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Yeah, and that's what we risk doing if we try to renegotiate or re-engineer or reform the DSU. It doesn't need fundamental change. It needs improvement. The timelines can be compressed considerably, and there are different ways and ideas of how to do that. There has been a slight amount of judicial overreach, and the members can, I think, legislate in WTO to confine and curtail that. And again, ideas have been proposed in the WTO to do that. And particularly in the area of trade defence, the scope of action of panels and appellate body is much more restricted than in other areas of WTO rulemaking, and that has not been, I think, sufficiently understood or appreciated by the appellate body or the panel system. So there are areas for improvement which would go halfway, I think, to meet the more legitimate concerns of the USA. But what we cannot do is question or undermine the independence of the appellate body. That's the basis of its legitimacy, and we should not go as far as to emasculate the system because of a US belief in its exceptionalism. Yeah, I mean the US position on the appellate body is simply, I think, a symptom of the current administration's view that international rulemaking does not apply to the USA, whether it's the Human Rights Council, the WTO, UNESCO, WHO, wherever. It's a withdrawing from multilateral pooling of sovereignty, of which the AB is a good example. So I think we must not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Thank you. Peter, anything you'd like to say, or shall we move to the questions?
No, I think that the appellate body works pretty well on the whole. I don't think we should get rid of it, but we can't fix it unless the chief critics are prepared to engage. It's not clear that's going to happen anytime soon.
Okay, I'll ask Dawn then if he could read out the questions that have been received in the course of the panel so far.
So thank you, Elaine. We've had a number of questions come in, all very interesting, and I think they break down into three separate buckets of kinds of questions. Some of them have been on the current contents of the WTO disciplines and whether those are sustainable. Second set of questions have come in with respect to the dispute resolution mechanism and its viability. And the third set of questions are, how is the WTO prepared to deal with some of the new challenges that are coming in? And so I think I want to start with one that came in very, very early on, and that is, is the future of rules-based international trading system promoted or in fact impaired with the bilateral agreements which are being formed, which are in fact not totally covering all of substantially all international trade between those two countries, such as happened with the US-Japan trade agreement or the US-China trade agreement. And are they simply anomalies, or will they in fact lead to some destructive endgame? So that's the first question. And the second question I'm going to throw out is almost a related question, but in a completely different area. What has been the success of a new initiative led by Canada and the European Union to develop an alternative dispute resolution system outside of the WTO? and to respond to the lack of judges at the appellate level. So sort of two effects of a impaired WTO system and resulting in these bilateral agreements and in a different kind of dispute resolution. So I think those are two important questions for the panelists.
Thank you very much, John. Given those questions and what we've already heard from John Clarke, I'm going to throw them over to you, John.
Being British, I'm a natural masochist, so that's fine. Yes, I think that on the question of these dirty partial bilaterals that do not meet the very high test of the GATT Article 24. The GATT requires that you, as you know, you cover substantially all trade in FTA. These don't meet it. If they are short-term, interim, temporary, we can live with that. But if they're not, then this is a very negative sign for the on the lack of respect that the US and their partners have for multilateral rules. And I think that is the basic problem. Yeah, we are seeing, and we've seen in the last year, notably with our US friends, a readiness to flout completely their WTO commitments. The US tariffs on China, completely illegal. They may have had some noble motivation or in terms of the desired effect, but they are illegal. And it's very ironic that the US on the one hand tells China, step up to the plate, follow WTO rules, be a responsible member of the community, but it uses illegal methods to actually leverage China to do that. I mean, there are many paradoxes in the US-China relationship. On the second issue that Don mentioned, where there have been questions about the interim dispute settlement mechanism that EU, Canada, China, and a bunch of other multilateralists have set up. This is obviously a second best solution. India is out of it. The USA is not part of it, and of course, any dispute settlement mechanism is only as strong as its participants. So it can only be a stopgap, temporary, pending a restoration, we hope, of the DSU system with the appellate body in the next year or two.
Thank you. Joe, any comments on the questions or what John has just told us?
Yeah, let me just echo a couple things that John has said, and I think put a little regional flavor on that, or U.S. flavor on that. Insofar as these agreements are concerned, I would agree that they certainly at this point look very partial and don't comply with Article 24. I think at least the Japan agreement, the administration acknowledged that this was, part one, that there would be further, further negotiations in other sectors, but it does right now look like an ag-only agreement, or for the most part ag-only. The China one looks like a long-term grain agreement. I mean, it's, these vague commitments to buy a bunch of commodities without real structural reforms in the sense of lowering tariffs or other things. So it's to me, they're even more problematic. If China goes through with it, great, that's great news for U.S. producers, and I'm not arguing that. But to me, to do that without reductions in tariffs, without some things that we normally would associate with increased trade, that they're temporary and essentially agreements between strong men, and that's great, but not sustainable. Insofar as the dispute resolution process is concerned, there too I would agree with John. I think that if you look at the record and look at over all of the disputes, the U.S. is one of the more active members, both in terms of bringing disputes and also having disputes brought against it, as is China and the EU and others. But to have so much of global trade outside of this interim solution, I think is again, is going to be hard to sustain that over time. But hopefully these sorts of efforts will at least keep the appellate body in play, and that we can get back to that. I mean, my fear would be that you know, we go back to a GATT situation where we don't have an appellate body. And I know some people actually would like that from the US, but I think for my purposes, or from my point of view at least, I think a strengthened appellate body, reformed appellate body is far, far, far preferable.
Thank you. Peter, before I turn to you, I just want to pick up on this last point, because I was one of the Canadian negotiators during the Uruguay round for the dispute settlement understanding. And I think what a lot of people have forgotten is that the appellate body was put in place as a means to get to automatic adoption of panel reports. And I think that that's something that people have forgotten, and that really people need to think again about the panel system and how well, in my view, it's functioned. Now, I also put my cards, you know, out on the table. I've been a chair of 2 panels and a member of 2 other panels, so I have a lot invested in the system. But I think the panel system is given short shrift when people talk about the DSU and they talk about the importance of the appellate body. I think there's a lot to be said for automatic adoption of panel reports, whether or not there is an appellate body. Now, having put that out on the table, let me turn to Peter and see if there's anything that Peter would like to contribute on this point.
Well, if you're expecting me to be provocative, I won't. I think that the secondary review is necessary for the reasons that you've just outlined. It has to be credible. Now, one of the reasons that the appellate body has become so useful is that it has modified so many panel decisions. Panel decisions aren't perfect. You need somebody to have a second look at them, and that enables people to governments to go back to their constituents and say, we tried. We exhausted every opportunity to deal with the issue. We have to change. So yes, these are the system that Canada and the EU are developing is excellent. We need it. I don't know that it'll bring the belligerents around anytime soon, but we shouldn't give up.
Okay, Dawn, back to you with questions. Shall we move to the first basket of questions, which related to WTO disciplines?
It's interesting. We've had a significant number of questions that are coming in with respect to developing in low-income countries, and how the WTO disciplines have actually succeeded in their goals or failed in their goals. And so how is it, one of the questions comes in, what do you think of, instead of going through the WTO, that the free trade agreements be developed between developing low-income countries with developed countries, such as EU members? And in fact, do the WTO restrictions on subsidies, are they still a burden for developing countries? So that's one of the angles of the disciplines seen from a developing country perspective. And thank you for those people who have joined us from lower income countries for posing those questions. And the other one that is of particular interest is the WTO requires disciplines to be on substantially all disciplines. Is there any room for future plurilateral agreements outside of WTO disciplines, which are sectoral in nature, including agriculture? So instead of having a WTA, World Trade Organization of Agriculture, agreement. So those were before contained as annexes, or should they be standalone plurilateral agreements? Two interesting questions for the panelists.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps this time we could start with you, Peter.
The question of whether or not it inhibits subsidies by developing countries is really whether or not they can afford to subsidize. In many cases, they can't. The disciplines are uneven because essentially the disciplines don't have a big impact on the countries with the deepest pockets. On the question of the trade agreements, like agriculture, being a standalone, I guess that's possible. But I don't think it should be a plurilateral. I think it has to be multilateral. The same disciplines should apply with adjustments in the ability, based on ability to comply. And there should be a lot more technical assistance to help countries who need help to come into compliance with the agreements or do their best.
Thank you. I'm going to turn over to John now, because I think at one point in your presentation, you mentioned that Africa has not reaped the benefits of trade, but it was not necessarily the fault of the WTO. Perhaps you might want to expand on this point in responding to the questions we've heard from Don.
Sure. In a comment yesterday, I threatened to quote Marcel Proust, and I said this is a very, very big question. You could answer it it would take weeks or days or a PhD to answer it. I feel like the guy in this famous Monty Python sketch of this quiz show where the contestants were asked to summarize the complete works of Proust in 15 seconds. So I'm going to try and summarize the complete works of Proust in 15 seconds, as it were, in answering this very, very complicated question. In a nutshell, no, I don't think the WTO is the root of the difficulties of sub-Saharan Africa in integrating international trade. It's actually helped them because the WTO protects small economies from discriminatory rules and behavior in their export markets. So the WTO is the best friend of small countries and SMEs in small countries. What we've seen in the EU's relations with Africa in the last few years is that they've been very, very happy to negotiate FTAs with us, and we have FTAs with virtually every African country and region. They've been less willing to actually open their markets to each other because they see themselves in direct competition with one another on commodities, on things that they produce. So the challenge is not developed country Africa relations; it's more intra-Africa trade and economic integration. That is really the challenge for many African countries in getting more prosperous and trading more. And we are working a lot with our African counterparts to encourage the creation across Africa of an Africa-wide continental FTA, so that the continent can actually pull its weight in international trade and economic affairs with the rest of the world. It's possible, and we've done it, to have very, very specific agreements with in certain sectors with LDCs and developing countries through the GSP system. Yeah. Yes, as Peter said, in general, if you have a trade agreement, you have to cover substantially all trade. Not defined in the WTO, as you know, Elaine, but we normally take it to mean 90% of trade and tariff lines. But there is no rule in the WTO about that. But in Africa, we at least, and I think Canada does the same, and many other countries, we offer unilateral concessions, one-way concessions, and we don't need to meet that GATT test of substantially all trade. There's a specific exception in the GATT for one-way concessions to the developing world, which we use very, very fully. Thanks.
Thank you. Joe, perhaps you might want to respond on this suggestion of a possible plurilateral agreement on agriculture.
Yeah, no, thanks. I was musing over John's point on Proust. I guess you could do it in 2 words: good cookie. But no, let's more seriously. Yeah, I think from the ag sector point of view, I guess back when I was serving as negotiator, we thought a lot about sectorals, but mainly on commodity grounds and whether or not you could look at, say, something like oil seeds and you know, think of an agreement that would reduce tariffs to 0 and reduce domestic support. The problem with the free trade agreements, again, getting back to what I said earlier, was that they do tend to focus, you know, on, say, market access issues. So they don't typically hit domestic support, largely because they're regional in focus, and you do have other, you know, and whereas a sectoral approach may allow you actually to address domestic support at the same time. The other big problem, which we haven't really talked about with free trade agreements, is all the standards that come along with it. And, you know, we've had free trade agreements with the US and other partners, and the EU and other partners, where we're both imposing different standards on foods and things like GIs and other things. And I think those are perfect candidates to be resolved in the multilateral system. Not saying that that's an easy thing either, but I think the last thing you want is a global trading system carved out by different standards and other sorts of things. I think that just prevents trade. I would agree with John's point on intra-regional trade in Africa. I think that is a very, very big issue, and has you know, so much of it moves informally, so we don't even have a good notion of exactly how much trade is actually flowing between countries. But other things, you know, so much of it is also due to infrastructure, roads being poor and other things, and that really, to see these efforts that are now underway to create a continental free trade agreement, I think, are very, very important. But I think these structural elements probably will have to be addressed as well.
Okay, one thing that struck me so far is none of us have mentioned the words climate change and where the WTO and the trading system, and in particular agriculture, fits in with what's going on with respect to climate change. And before I turn it back to Don to ask about the other questions that he's received, I wonder if each of you could speak to that point. Joe, perhaps we'll start. Could you start?
Yeah, no, thanks. And that's a great point, because we are seeing now a talk of border measures going in play, and I think that they will create challenges. All the more reason to have a functioning WTO where these issues are being debated, and if disputes arise, they are being resolved, which I think is going to be very, very important. I think obviously there's a lot of things agriculture can do. I think it's really key for all the, we talk a lot about things like climate smart agriculture to support subsidies that will you know, help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or at least mitigate the impacts. And I think the important thing there is to make sure that they're not done in ways that distort trade, because I think trade is going to be even more important in the future insofar as agriculture is concerned, because indeed, as climate change occurs, it's going to shift production regionally, and I think will exacerbate imports for some countries, which means that a functioning trade system is going to be even more important in the future.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, no, another Proustian subject, frankly. No, I think Joe is right that you know, agriculture has been seen as part of the problem in the last 20 years. It now is starting to reposition itself as part of the solution on climate action. The EU agricultural system is very, very far from perfect. We've damaged biodiversity, soil, air quality, etc. Hang on, let's press that. Can you see me? Yeah. You know, we are the only major agricultural region in the world who have been able to produce, but releasing fewer GHG emissions in the last 20 years. So we're in the right direction. We have a lot more to do. We've recently, on biodiversity and on a farm to fork holistic food systems strategy, as part of our aim by 2050. And that is quite a courageous strategy in diplomatic terms, which we are determined to meet. We have said all along that whatever we do in terms of agriculture and climate change must be WTO compatible. So the support that we will give to farmers for delivering the public good, which is environmental, husbandry and climate action, will be WTO compatible. We also want to align this with the SDGs, especially 1 and 2 and others, and actually introduce into the WTO a discussion on this. I think there is a lot of scope, particularly coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, for the WTO to position itself as an organization which is dedicated to accomplishing the SDGs. And particularly the whole cluster of SDGs to do with agriculture, environment, climate change, health, and poverty. And as Joe was implying, I think it would be very, very important that in the WTO we have a very open debate the WTO, how the WTO rules can support members how to take climate action, including. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you, John. Peter?
In addition to border adjustment measures, transportation is a big problem for distant markets. If the modes of transport have to be subject to some kind of tax or adjustment, the absence of a mention of climate change in the recently concluded NAFTA 2.0 is concerning. It shows differences of opinion on the issue. I'm a bit concerned that climate change may get tied up with trade in a broader sense coming out of the pandemic and could become captive, because when we get to trying to fix the rules-based system, how much attention is agriculture going to get? If you look at the WTO website on the measures that have been taken and the measures that have been relaxed, virtually all of it is on PPEs. Very, very few on agriculture, and most of those are measures by countries who are imposing export controls in order to safeguard their food supply. So the problem hasn't emerged yet. It may emerge in a greater sense, but I'm not sure who's going to get all the airtime on this issue.
Thank you, Peter. That's an interesting point, and I think it was one that Alan Oxley made very early on, which was that the current crisis with respect to COVID shouldn't really figure predominantly in the discussion about the future of the WTO. And that's something that we haven't followed up on. And so I'm wondering whether anyone would like to comment on where we are now, the impact of COVID on the WTO, or perhaps you agree with Alan that it may not have a major impact.
Well, I read carefully all of Alan Wolf's speeches around the world. And
I was referring to Alan Oxley.
no, but I'm answering the question in a different way. And it has been one of the prime motivators for trying to deal with reform. I don't think that what's been happening because of the pandemic is really going to drive the reform as we go. There have been a number of reasonable measures, but the measures to open markets probably outweigh those that have been taken to close them.
Thanks, Peter. Any views from Joe or John?
Yeah, I'm happy to contribute to this. It's obviously we're not out of the COVID crisis by any means. It's a bit early to draw conclusions. Like when Nixon went to China and he said to Zhou Enlai said, what's been the impact of the French Revolution? They said it's too early to tell. I think it's a bit the same with COVID. I think there are two things which may come out of this in WTO terms. First of all, we're going to face an economic recession across the world. How long that will be remains to be seen, but that's going to increase poverty. Joe and IFPRI have done some interesting analysis of that, and so sub-Saharan Africa is going to be very, very badly affected, not by the disease itself, but by the economic downturn that in the wake of it, and that's going to have an impact on poverty levels, on hunger, on the meeting the SDGs, and also incidentally their positioning in the WTO in terms of liberalisation reform, their attitude towards globalisation. I think that there is a sense that COVID-19 is a kind of a result of excessive globalisation. Yeah, so I think that is going to be one of the kind of consequences of this. The second is I fear that there may be some recourse to more nativist and nationalistic trade policies. We have already a lot of populist and nativist leaders around the world, and we're seeing some signs, even in Europe to a small extent, of binational, close down the borders, buy local, be more autonomous, build up domestic stockpiles, don't depend on any other countries for your supplies. It's a very dangerous direction to go too far in. More investment screening, let's protect our strategic industries. There may be some case in the health sector for avoiding excessive dependence on one supplier, one market, but diversification must be the answer, not focusing on domestic self-sufficiency. And we're also seeing in the agricultural and food area a mixture of responses. Yeah, on the very positive side, and many of us have publicly stated the importance of keeping borders open, markets open, agri-food trade flowing, and we've been successful. But the health crisis has not also been accompanied by a food security crisis, at least in most parts of the world. There's been big drops in demand in some sectors, but not so much problems of supply, and prices of agri-food have not oscillated dramatically as it did in 27-28. So I think we've learned a lot of lessons, and the system is not broken; it's resilient. But we are seeing a number of countries have introduced export restrictions: Ukraine, Russia, Thailand, a few others. Australia, amazingly, introducing export subsidies for exports of goods flown on Qantas aeroplanes. The USA, with its massive $19-20 billion trade distorting support for its farmers, partly COVID related, partly compensation for the farmers for the disastrous agri-trade policy that Trump has had with China. So in some respects, countries are also going in the wrong direction as a result of COVID. And I hope that these distorting measures will be very, very temporary, and that we will all in the WTO come back to common sense and recognize that the solution to the recovery when it comes to agriculture and food is keeping markets open, continuing the reform process on subsidies and so on, dealing with export restrictions, dealing with transparency where there are problems, and we can do a lot of improvements certainly in the short term, the WTO, and recognizing that the food system has been quite resilient, and we should be thankful for that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, John. Joe, any comments?
Yeah, just briefly, and they're mainly echoing some of John's comments because I would agree with him. I think this is clearly the first time since 2007, 8, 2010, 11 when we had the big price hikes, spikes because of droughts and other shortfalls around the world, and we saw at that time countries implementing export bans and other restrictions that really exacerbated that. Ironically, it came at a time during the negotiations in Doha that during the Doha round that people were aware of it. There was just little oxygen left to kind of debate that issue, and the G20, of course, in 2011 came out with a strong statement saying at least for humanitarian aid there should be no export restrictions. But even that, when it was taken to Geneva, some of the same members who agreed to it in the G20 objected to it when it came time to getting something agreed to in the WTO. And hopefully it would be great to see some progress along those lines. And I think it's encouraging that the G20 again has taken up that, certainly on things like transparency, where a lot of the measures that John has mentioned, still haven't been notified to the WTO. We've seen it with organizations like Global Trade Alert or international organizations like IFPRI or OECD, which has tried to monitor those actions. But the worrisome thing to me is to see again the calls for self-sufficiency, and that's both in developed countries and developing countries, and I think that those are pressures that drive a wedge in sort of multilateralism, and just at a time when I think trade is even more important, to have countries arguing that no, we should be doing that ourselves and subsidizing our producers or whatever. I've already mentioned all of the COVID related, the massive amounts of aid given to U.S. farmers, and I'm not disputing the fact that we've also seen enormous costs to the sector, but the worrisome thing to me is, well, what happens after that? People already in Congress are talking about raising the cap on U.S. farm spending, talking about, well, should we make this part of the baseline? That is the normal part, and largely because these payments have far exceeded what's paid out under the statutory farm bill and other safety net measures. So these are all concerning trends as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Dawn, I'm going to go back to you and ask you if you've received more questions that you'd like to put to our panelists.
I've received many questions, and I'm trying to distill them into a form that will be very productive so that we can let the panelists cover some areas that they haven't covered. And one of the ones that's come in is very interesting. If anyone's seen the old movie called Miss Congeniality with Sandra Bullock, every beauty pageant contestant was asked how to attain world peace. And there's a question that's come in about world peace. So I want to relate that one. It's often argued that freer trade is a core aspect of attaining and maintaining world peace, but with very different and potentially clashing versions of capitalism practiced by liberal democracies in the Western world versus capitalism as practiced in China. Do the panelists worry that trade and trade policy is actually escalating rather than mitigating the risk of global conflict? Is there any one thing that the WTO can do to promote a new understanding of world trade?
Well, I think we're back to our 15-second Proust analogy, but who would like to start with that?
I'll have a go. I mean, let me let the audience into a dirty secret. The WTO does not believe in free trade. You can read the WTO, the GATT, all the agreements, all 400 pages. I've got them here. Doesn't mention free trade anywhere. Yeah, the WTO is actually about progressive market opening to the extent that its members agree and can accommodate that, underpinned by international rules which protect smaller and weaker countries. So free trade is not in the WTO rule book at all. And in that respect, that's why I think the WTO is a instrument for stability and peace. It's I said earlier on that the WTO has been a victim of its own success. It's actually a much stronger international organization than most of the UN system. It has binding rules. It has or had until recently a multinational binding court system which could not be overturned. And the problem is not so much the WTO, it's the problem that the rest of the UN system, or the UN system as a whole, does not have that kind of weight or power, because the members of the world community have decided not to give the UN that power. So yes, I think in short, the WTO can contribute to world peace within its own modest remit. 15 years ago, the NGO community, bless their cotton socks in Seattle, they were regarding the WTO as the devil incarnate. Yeah, it's not the devil incarnate, nor is it the panacea for many problems that the world faces. The WTO has its own modest role to play in managing international trade according to rules that protect countries from discrimination, transparency, and a panel and DSU system to adjudicate differences. That is its role, and we should appreciate it. We should try to strengthen it, but we cannot ever try to claim that the WTO can be the harbinger or the panacea for world peace. That has to come from other parts of the world international system.
Peter.
Don't have much different to say on that issue. The GATT was set up, among other things, to help bring about world peace or lasting peace. It can bring trade peace. I don't think it can bring global peace in terms of the various, various other issues that have countries at each other's throats.
Joe, and maybe I could ask you a little more specifically about the point of the two different systems, the US or the liberal capital democratic system and the Chinese system, and how that plays out in the WTO and the role of the WTO.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's in one sense, one of the beauties of the WTO is that it can accommodate a lot of different types of governments or social structures or other things. But again, according to a transparent system of rules, and what it doesn't mean is that one country can play by one set of rules, another country can play by yet another set of rules, at least in theory. So I'd like to remind people here, the WTO doesn't have a lot of soldiers with blue hats that go out and enforce laws. That this is the rules of the WTO are enforced by its members, and we take cases against other countries when we feel that they are outside their law, and those are brought before independent panels that then rule on those. And again, again, beating a dead horse, I know. I think the system was worked fairly well. I mean, I think there are issues on industrial subsidies and other things that need to be addressed. There's a lot of areas within the WTO that need further reforms, and not just the rules in terms of how the organization functions, but in terms of moving opening markets further, as John had mentioned. So yeah, no, it's a fairly modest role, I guess, in the grand scheme of things. But even, but I think it does contribute certainly to less discord in the world.
Thank you. Dawn, another question?
So one of the questions, and it's interesting that Joe just brought it up, is the whole idea around other sectors who have started to do domestic subsidies. And one of the question comes up with, how does the revival of talks around industrial subsidies at the WTO affect agricultural negotiations? So it's a pretty specific question, but I think it has a lot of certainly interest in the questions, and it may put some opportunities to the panel to discuss the other parts of WTO besides agriculture and the impact on agriculture.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps we could go back to Joe.
I don't have much to add. I mean, I think that there are certainly those areas need to be looked at, and they're fairly, you know, the complaints are particularly during times like this when you see a lot of response to economic problems being generated by money being provided, and not just you know, and particularly when you see big industries like airline industries and other things being affected by these problems. How, you know, I think there's one issue. There's one thing if this is a temporary measure to try to get an industry back on its feet because of a very extraordinary circumstance. I think that would be viewed one way. But if it's a continued effort to offset, which, you know, maybe an uncompetitive position or something like that, I think that's quite a different aspect as far as the world trade system is concerned. And I think that we should be very concerned about the level of subsidies.
Thank you. Peter?
Any relaxation of the rules on industrial subsidies or non-agricultural subsidies has to be very temporary. There has been massive amounts of money provided in a number of countries to keep, for example, the steel industry running, the automotive industry running, and without that support, we'd have much higher unemployment than we do now. But it's emergency support, and it should be treated as emergency support. And if the rules are weakened, then there'll be even less imperative to try to discipline agricultural subsidies.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this started out as a China issue and has now become a global issue. When I think when China joined the WTO, we assumed that it would continue its market reforms and become like a quote unquote Western market economy. It hasn't done, and the degree of state control of the economy is extraordinary, and state subsidies is extraordinary. And when we negotiated the Euro round, Elaine, I mean, that was before China was a member, and we didn't anticipate the need for rules on subsidies, anti-dumping, safeguards, etc., which would take into account a country like China. So the rules objectively need some updating, I think, to take into account the reality of China as a non-market economy with increasing state intervention in its affairs. So irrespective of COVID, there's an important agenda on industrial subsidization, I think, to pursue in the WTO to try and have a more level playing field and more even competition. I don't think we care, or we can't care what kind of political system China has or any other country has, but we do want to have a reasonable level playing field for competition, both in the China market and as importers. Now, added to that, now we have as Peter and Joe have said, we have now the problem of very heavy propping up of ailing industries, aircraft, steel, transport, etc. If it's temporary, yes, I think we all understand it's necessary to maintain economies, maintain people in labour. But as we found in the agricultural area, once a particular sector starts getting a subsidy, it's very hard to wean them off the subsidy. So I really hope it will be temporary. We, from the European Union point of view, we have not subsidized, we've not propped up in any major extent our agricultural sector through this crisis. Farmers do get direct support in any case, so there was no market reason to do much more. We've taken a few emergency measures in the wine sector, in a few other sectors that were collapsing, but very, very limited compared to what we're seeing elsewhere in the world. I would be very open, as we were before the Buenos Aires Ministerial, to see a serious renegotiation of the agricultural agreement on domestic support. The EU and Brazil, 2 years ago, we made a proposal to reform domestic support, that we would all take a proportionate cut according to our levels of support and our economic development. But it didn't fly. China said no. They wanted to have total policy space for their subsidies. India said no for the same reasons, and the USA said no for the same reasons. So we were stuck. But the fact that EU and Brazil got together, unprecedented. Yeah, I would never imagine that 10 years ago. To propose domestic support cuts in agriculture was quite something, and we would like to return to that agenda in the next few years, hoping that the COVID-19 outcomes will lead members of WTO to realize that we need to open the economies more rather than close them down with more and more subsidies.
That's a very interesting point, John. And perhaps, Joe, you've talked a bit about the level of domestic support in the United States and your concerns about whether this extraordinarily large level now becomes the base. Perhaps you might want to make some further comments on the points that John just raised.
Yeah, no, thanks, Elaine. Yeah, I mean, I've had some concerns for some time, just the general direction. Part of the problem of I think it's been, unfortunately, when the round broke down in 2008, understandably, the WTO members wanted to pull something out of it. And so little by little, the low-hanging fruit was sort of harvested. I made reference to this in an earlier comment, but export subsidies, for example, and a few other areas, TRQ administration, some things that were good things, needed to happen. But unfortunately, to think about structuring a bigger package or to take another pillar, I think it will get a little more difficult. And I think it's hard to imagine the U.S. agreeing to reductions in domestic support within that pillar alone, without market access. And I think historically, you can see why the Uruguay round was structured the way it was, but part of the problem is you do have some countries that support producers by very, very high tariff walls. Largely, those are countries that can't afford income support the way richer countries have been able to provide their producers. But how to put that to make progress there. I think it is true that a lot of countries have a lot of so-called water in their domestic support bindings. That is, they're operating at levels well below their caps. But there are others that either look at, like China or India, that look at potential be able to go. They don't want to be constrained. The U.S., which has its own problems of having support, which had moved towards more decoupled support, then moved back in recent years to more support coupled to price. And so the fact that we're up near our bindings and as I say, over our bindings these last 2 years is in part due to the policies that we now have. And I think that one way or the other, that's something that you at least as a negotiator look at this and say, okay, well, this is a true cost, and I might look at it as an economist and say, I think unilateral reforms would be really great to move away from these support payments. But in fact, people will want there, and I think the only trade-offs that we're going to have to see there is something on market access. And I don't think that's out of the question. It's just that we know it was pretty difficult in the text we ended up with in 2008 was a very, very complicated text, and I think something far, far, far more simple would be best way to approach it. But I think that I'm still optimistic that could be done.
Thank you. Peter, any comments?
U.S. subsidies are a mixed blessing to Canada. When feed grains are subsidized in the United States, it reduces the cost of feed grains in Canada, so it helps the poultry and livestock industries. But it doesn't do anything to help Canadian grains and oilseeds producers. We've been following these things, these subsidies very, very closely for years and years. They seem to be in the U.S. political DNA, and that's going to have to change before we can deal with them.
Okay. John, I have a last question I want to put to the panelists. But before that, perhaps you could tell me if you've got any more questions that you'd like to put from the participants.
I've got one last burning question, which I think was raised by Alan in his presentation from Australia. And one of the participants in the seminar has continued on with this question. To what extent has China sought to fill US recalcitrance towards the WTO? And is China using other avenues to assert their leadership in multilateral systems, which will be less than beneficial to a multilateral trading system? So we're back on the China question. Last question.
Okay, let's start with John Clarke.
Well, the short answer is no. I don't think China purports to or can replace the long-standing traditional role of the US as a motor of the multilateral trade system. China is a new member of the WTO to some extent. Its economic model doesn't fit very well with the WTO framework, and it's despite its rhetoric about being a paid-up member of the multilateral system, it's still fairly defensive and secretive in many ways. So it cannot and will not fulfill the role that the USA has abandoned. We need today in the WTO to move forward. We need not the Quad. We need at least the USA, China, the EU, and I would say the African Union, the four participants to actually move the system forward. Without those four, I think we will not make significant reform. China will have to make a contribution to WTO reform and rulemaking, as I said earlier, commensurate with its economic clout. there is a disconnect today, and on this USA is right, between China's benefiting from the WTO system. It's now the world's biggest trader, and its compliance and readiness to participate in more strict rulemaking on subsidies, IPR, tech transfer, state control of the economy, etc., competition, level playing field, investment, transparency, etc., market access. China needs to really step up to the plate and start to walk the walk and not just talk the talk as a member of the international community. Until it does that, and I don't see any sign of it yet, it cannot replace the traditional role of the USA as the motor of multilateral progress.
Thank you, John. Peter and then Joe on this point.
Well, John gave us a very good list of the things that are wrong with China's participation. I'd say the greatest one is lack of transparency and inability to play by the rules. I don't see the United States losing its leadership role if it ever wants to take it back. There's no substitute, and the type of quad that John mentioned, I think, would be ideal.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
Could I come in very quickly on that, Delaney, if you don't mind?
Sure.
I think I agree with all of that, but I think the US has already abandoned its leadership role in the WTO, yeah, very explicitly and deliberately, in asphyxiating the DSU system, in imposing totally illegal tariffs on China, the EU, and others. You know, they have consciously abandoned their leadership of the multilateral system since the Bretton Woods era. Yeah. So China can't replace that, but the USA has got a lot of climbing up to do to get back into that role that it used to have.
Peter, do you want to respond to that?
Can I come back on that, Ella, please? I did say the United States could be a leader if it wanted to take it back. I agree with you that it's abandoned it.
Joe.
Yeah, no, the only thing I would add to that, and I mean, I think that if you look back at the last 12, 15 years, I mean, it's easy to point to the Trump administration as being a big change, sea change, and it certainly was. Wouldn't argue with that, but really the 8 years prior to that were, I think, because of the global recession and other things, the U.S. certainly was less active in Geneva, but certainly not actively trying to dismantle things, which I think they have been over the last 3 years. And I think assuming this does go back at some point where the U.S. does feel it wants to be engaged in a more productive way, I think it's going to take a little bit of time. I don't think this is just everyone says, "Oh, great, you're back. Here's the place at the table." We're a big player, and we always will have a big place at the table. But I think to get the trust and everything else, I think there's going to have to be actions along those lines and real leadership. And hopefully we'll see that.
Thank you. So I think we've heard a lot of really, really interesting points in the course of today's discussion. Before I turn it back to Dawn for the final closing remarks, I'm going to put a final question to the three of you. It's sort of like the rapid fire response round. So I think today is the closing date for candidates to be nominated to be the next Director General of the WTO. So I guess my question is a multi-part question, but I'm just looking for your quick responses. Do you think there's any chance that we will have a successor in place by the time the current DG steps down at the end of August? Do you want to give your best guess about who that successor might be? And finally, what words of advice would you have for the new DG in terms of moving the system forward and moving it forward quickly, say within a year? So not a lot to ask, but three-part question to each one of you, short answers, and perhaps we can go in the order in which we started, which was Joe, John, and Peter.
Rats, I knew it would happen. I'd get it back. Yeah, a quick answer, no. I don't think we'll have one by August. I would be very, very surprised. I think the good news is there are a lot of really good candidates, include two very strong women from Africa. And a strong candidate from Mexico. I mean, again, you can go down that list and see a lot of good candidates. I would be foolish, I think, to put forward a preference without hearing more and other things. But I think one thing, whoever gets it is going to have to spend a lot of time trying to repair this body and do it with a lot of quiet and at times not so quiet leadership.
Okay, thank you. John.
Well, as a public official, I must be very prudent on this question. Fortunately, there is no EU candidate, fortunately or unfortunately, so we don't have our own dog in the race. No, Joe is right. There will not be a new DG by the end of August. It will take a bit longer. I think actually the planning in the WTO is that it will take a bit longer than that, through logistical and other reasons. We have a lot of very good candidates, very credible ones. I know 5 of them, and all of them would be very, very good. I'm not going to put bets on who should get the job, but I do note that 2/7 of the candidates are very, very competent African women politicians. And, you know, as Shakira said, you know, or sang, you know, this time it's Africa.
And what words of advice for the new DG?
Well, I hardly want to give advice on the new DG. They have to listen very, very, very carefully. They have to really understand the problems of small countries who feel often swamped and outweighed in the WTO. They have to listen to the business community around the world, and they have to try to build bridges and build consensus and be very firm. So maybe all those things are not compatible with one another, but I think that's the best advice I can give them at this point in time. Thanks, Helene.
Peter.
Well, I think it should be a lady this time around. There's some good candidates. I'm not going to give them any advice. It's not going to happen by August. That's why Roberto's going early, because he had to do it very quickly himself. I think he wants to have lots of time up front.
Okay, well, with that, with those final points, let me turn back to Dawn Buckingham to provide us with final remarks.
There we go. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to have you all with us today for this first dialogue of managing agricultural trade in an increasingly chaotic world. There doesn't seem to be any doubt that our world has become somewhat chaotic, and it doesn't seem to be any doubt that there's some degree of coordination and management required for a global trading system, which seems to have strayed a bit from its multilateral base of rules with respect to orderly trading arrangements. We've really had an opportunity, and I really want to thank each of the panelists very, very much, Joe and Peter and John and Alan, and especially Elaine for moderating today. And we've had an opportunity, I think, to take a look at some of the limits of the WTO system, which existed even before the COVID crisis, and now also the prospects of a world trading system which will exist after the COVID or during the COVID pandemic. So I hope you've enjoyed the session today. We had over 100 participants, and we really have been excited by the prospect of putting this panel together, and really invigorated by the questions that you've submitted online. So we would like to thank you again to the panelists and to the participants and to the moderator. And we'd ask that you would please consider joining us for our second in this series of managing agricultural trade in an increasingly chaotic world, which will have the title and the perspective of trying to look at sustainability and efficient agricultural trade. So please register now. Go to either the CAPI website or the Farm Foundation website. That webinar is going to be taking place on Wednesday, July 22nd, 2020 at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, or 10 o'clock Central Time, or make the necessary adjustments in the time zone where you find yourself located. So thanks to all. We hope to see you at our next event, and thank you for your participation today. Have a great day.